friends and colleagues from the Vera Institute. And so we want to welcome you to the space. We're also going to be going live on Facebook for the first portion of our presentation. This is going to be a deep dive into the data. And so what we'd like for you to do is please let us know when you have questions, right? And so as soon as we are live, we're going to put our questions up so that you can fill up the comment section with some of your reflections from part 1 and part 2. And so for today, I am going to be your moderator. My name is Mordecai. And again, welcome to the Lansing People's Assembly. So today this is the third part. Like, this has been an amazing series. And this is the third part in our series, The Power of Prosecution. So here's what we're going to do to get everything rolling. Please share your thoughts and reflections that you have from part 1 and part 2, right? And so even if you don't have a question, right, you might even have a question, something that you want us to answer. So put your questions in the comment section on Zoom. And those of you all that are with us online on Facebook, right, put your questions in the comment section as well. We've got folks that are monitoring the comment section. Now, if you have a reflection, something that just stuck out to you from the first 2 parts, we want you to also place those reflections, put those down, put those in the comment section. So, and then our last question, what would you like to know about prosecution? So you've got questions, you've got reflections, you've got specific questions about prosecution. We want you to fill up that comment section. While you are doing that, we're going to play our video.
In 1619, when the first Africans were brought to the British colonies by ship to Jamestown, Virginia, they held the legal status of servant. But as the region's economic system became increasingly dependent on forced labor, we descended into slavery. The institution of American slavery developed as a permanent, hereditary system centrally tied to race. Millions of black people were forcibly taken from Africa, crammed on ships and brought to the Americas through a dangerous and deadly journey that crossed the Atlantic. Millions died. Once on our shores, slavery deprived the enslaved person of any legal rights or autonomy, and granted the slave owner complete power over the black men, women, and children legally recognized as property. An ideology of white supremacy, a narrative of racial difference was created to rationalize and justify the continuation of slavery. American slavery was often brutal, barbaric, and violent. In addition to the hardship of forced labor, enslaved people were maimed or killed by slave owners as punishment for working too slowly, visiting a spouse living on another plantation, or even learning to read. Enslaved people were also sexually exploited. The United States Congress finally banned the importation of slaves from Africa in 1808. Slavery was widely considered a gross human rights violation, yet enslavement was retained and persisted. The 1808 Declaration caused the demand for slave labor to skyrocket in the Lower South, and the domestic slave trade grew to meet this demand. Between 1808 and 1860, the enslaved population of Alabama grew from less than 40,000 to more than 435,000. Slave traders chained African Americans together in couples and forced them to march hundreds of miles from the Upper South to the Lower South. Steamboats carried slaves along the Alabama River. Rail routes constructed with slave labor brought hundreds of enslaved people to Montgomery, Alabama every day, turning the city into one of the largest slave trading communities in the United States. Enslaved people would be paraded up Commerce Street to slave warehouses and slave depots. The city's slave market was at the Artesian Basin, now known as Court Square. Enslaved people of all ages were auctioned along with livestock, standing in line to be inspected. Public posters advertising the sale of slaves included gender, age, skill, complexion, owner's name, and price. Slavery in America traumatized and devastated millions of people. Husbands and wives, parents and children could not protect themselves from being sold away from each other. Enslaved families were separated at an owner's or auctioneer's whim, never to see each other again. The domestic slave trade separated nearly half of all enslaved people from their spouses and parents. In 1833, the Alabama legislature banned free black people from residing in the state, meaning that enslavement was the only legally authorized status for African Americans. Even as the Civil War raged, slave trading in Montgomery flourished well into the mid-1860s. After the Confederacy's surrender in 1865, Congress passed the 13th Amendment, which prohibited slavery nationwide except as a punishment for crime. But in many former slave states, slavery did not end. It simply evolved. Southern whites, angry after losing the war, targeted black people who were largely abandoned by the federal government in the 1870s. For decades, black men, women, and children were tortured, terrorized, and killed by mobs and violent lynchings, oppressed by a system of racist laws and customs. For another 100 years, black people were racially segregated, denied the right to vote, education, and basic dignity. They were humiliated, beaten, or killed for minor offenses or for protesting. The civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s helped to end legally authorized racial segregation, but racial bias still persists. Today, a presumption of guilt is assigned to many people of color who are disproportionately arrested, convicted of crimes, and sent to prison. African Americans are 6 times more likely to be sentenced to prison for the same crime as a white person. 1 in 3 black males born today can expect to spend time in prison during his lifetime. Police violence against black people is so epidemic that civil rights demonstrations have shut down cities across the U.S. as thousands of people march to protest police brutality. Many states celebrate the era of slavery with Confederate holidays and by honoring the defenders and architects of slavery while ignoring the history of enslavement. The Equal Justice Initiative believes that racial bias remains a serious problem and is a direct and lasting legacy of American slavery and our failure to deal with the history of racial injustice. The Equal Justice Initiative seeks to foster an honest conversation about the legacy of slavery, about mass incarceration, and racial inequality and how it still affects millions of people today. We can confront and overcome bias and discrimination. Please join us in this conversation so that we can move forward together.
So again, we want to welcome you to the Lansing People's Assembly for the 3rd part of our series, The Power of Prosecution. That video really lays context for our conversation and our ongoing conversation. We're talking about a history that continues to persist and morph into and be reinforced through various institutions. And that is the backdrop of this conversation today. We're talking about real people, real families. And so we felt that video really helped us to, the purpose was to help us to level set. And so if you have any reflections, right, put those in the comment section. We've already got questions in the comment section already. And for those of you all that are online, we will bring your questions from online into the Zoom. And so I'd like to always highlight our Lansing People's Assembly partners. And so without our partners, right, we wouldn't be able to gather the way we're gathering. And so we thank all of our partners. And if you would like to be a partner of the Lansing People's Assembly, right, a sponsor, please put that in the comment section as well. When we talk about our agenda today, pretty standard. We'll talk briefly about, what is a People's Assembly, and we'll just jump right in where we left off. And we'll have some introductions from our colleagues and friends at Vera. And then we're going to ask them to lead us in our conversation as we move forward. The Lansing People's Assembly is really a gathering, a multiracial, multi-generational gathering where the collective, not the elected, determine the outcomes. And so when we gather, we are the ones who set the agenda for our city, the priorities. and we hold ourselves accountable, right? And so we want to, again, remind you that COVID, we had to change our protocol. So most of our gatherings have been virtual. But as you can see from the screen, a people's assembly is also a celebration of the culture of a city, of a people. And so as you can see, after COVID is kind of done its thing, we're going to go back to in-person gatherings where we're strategizing and we're meeting and we're celebrating art, music, and dance. And so we're looking forward to that. Everyone can play a role, as we said in our last conversation. The assembly collectively answers what are our problems, right? And what are the solutions, and what are we going to do about it? So again, the collective, not the elected, determine the outcomes. Our goal is the beloved community. And so we'd like to read this, right? What are we aiming at? A community where the conditions that create crime and violence are no longer present. That's why we're having this conversation today, right? And again, thank you for joining us. The outcomes can no longer be predicted by race, and racial hierarchy is no longer the norm. Everyone feels welcome and everyone feels safe. I'd like to this time bring our colleagues from Vera. And so, Jack, I'm going to ask you to lead us off in introducing the rest of the team that's here. And so, Jack, go ahead. I'm gonna actually stop sharing my screen, and we'll go from there.
Hey everyone, thank you again for inviting us into your space. My name is Jack from the, I apologize for that. I'm part of the Vera Institute's Reshaping Prosecution program. We've been working with Carol's office for, I want to say maybe a year now. And we've been working very closely in her office to, talk about how do we adjust and change the way that we prosecute cases in a way that can maximize the liberty of those who are directly impacted folks, while so centering Black and Brown communities that are directly exposed to and sometimes even targeted by the criminal legal system. So I myself, I'll do a quick round of intros of our team, and then I'm going to turn it over to our data researcher, Andrew, who did the analysis in Carol's office. So I myself, I'm a former prosecutor. I worked in the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office in New York City for about 4 years. I've also from there did some police accountability work in our local government agency that oversaw the NYPD. It was an independent agency separate from the NYPD. And then I came to the Reshaping Prosecution program because it was really important to me to kind of use the lessons learned from when I was a prosecutor doing policy work in the office. It was really important to me to kind of use those lessons to help other prosecutors, adjust the way that they do their work and bring them closer together with the communities that they serve. Prosecution is supposed to be about justice and public safety. And so, the voices of those who are directly impacted, who need the safety, either, from community-based solutions to safety, from that all the way to how do we look at the system of prosecution within the larger system of the criminal legal system that has evolved from slavery. So that's kind of what our project does by working with prosecutors' offices to kind of shrink the way that they use their power and think about using their power in a way that can support directly impacted community members. So, like I said, I'm super excited to be here. Thank you so much to One Love Global. Thank you so much for being here. Carol, I think it's incredible that you're also part of these conversations. And I'm going to turn it over to another member of the team, Sarah Darwish, to introduce themselves, and then to Andrew. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, Jack, and thank everyone for having us in your space again. We're really excited to share the data today. And this data is really about the decision-making that the prosecutor's office does that impacts you all, your loved ones, your community. So really believe in the ways that truly matter, that this is y'all's data. And it's really, really important that you all, of course, have access to it. And I'm really appreciative to you, Carol, for holding that value of data transparency and being here to share this data with everyone. And I'll just plug too, it's great to see so many familiar faces or familiar names on the Zoom today. We do have been reaching out to folks throughout the past year that we've been working in Ingham, and always love to connect with folks in the community to have a better idea of how we should be doing this work. So I'll add my email to the chat too, if anybody wants to reach out during, after the call. And with that, thanks again, and I'll pass it over to Andrew.
Thanks. At the risk of being totally redundant, just underscore and say and echo all the thanks that Jack and Sarah laid out. I am Andrew Taylor, as they indicated. I'm the data analyst on the team. I do all the quantitative research related to the data that we have from Carol's office and they've been able to share with us. I would say this is often the best part of my job. You know, I come from a decent amount of experience doing this sort of analysis in either public health spaces or other sort of data science for social good like places. And really the best part of this, in my opinion, is when I get a chance to actually share it with people who it affects and that it has some impact in the world on. So this is a privilege for me, and I would just, reiterate all the thanks for having me in the space here. And I'd also say that this is deeply personal stuff to me. I'm lucky enough to be able to make this my job, to work on reform in the criminal legal system, and I am myself a product of reform in the criminal legal system. I went through a successful diversion program that at the time I went through, it was only 2 years old. So if I was 5 years older, I would have had a dramatically different life. And I try to keep that in my scopes all the time whenever we think about how it is we can reform things. Even small changes can make a big difference sometimes. And so with that, I'm going to jump right into this today. Let me ask the forever Zoom question here. Can we see everything correctly? All right. Now, as the title indicates here, right, these are our preliminary findings. This is just to say this is everything that we have so far. A lot of this stuff we're going to continue to work through. A lot of these things may change by the time we get to a final report, but we want to share stuff now so that we can start to get some feedback, start to get some input from all of you. A little bit of a dated picture. Our team has changed a lot in the last year, but this was current, as of the time that we made this slide deck the first time anyway. And this is all of our wonderful people. You probably recognize some of us from the Zoom boxes at least. And then just give you a little bit of a roadmap of what I'm going to be talking about for roughly the next hour here, right? So we're going to talk about our findings so far, talk about where we hope to go with some other questions. We're going to have some time specifically related to some recent policy changes by the office. And of course, ultimately, when I get to the end, talk about some additional discussion, both on where we're headed next, and both on, of course, the stuff we're going to look through today. Now, really kind of important framing point I want to leave out here, or I want to throw out rather, before we get started. I am not an expert in the criminal justice system of Ingham County. I don't know very much about Ingham County at all. In fact, neither does anybody else at Vera. So all of you, by virtue of being on this call, are going to know a hell of a lot more about what it's like to live in Ingham County than I'm ever going to know. And so I'm going to show you a lot of data points that we've collected from the one data system that we have access to and a few other things we've been able to find. But they are one part of a large story about the narrative of what's going on here. And so I really want to, as much as humanly possible, try to come at this like it's a conversation, talk about what fits with people's experiences, talk about where else we can dig for other things, talk about where we may be way off, or there might be problems in the data that we have access to in the first place. So I hope we can all keep that in mind as we jump through. And with that in mind, what are we actually going to look at today? To lay this out as a little bit more of a roadmap here. We'll talk about trends in cases received or warrant requests submitted. I'm going to use the terms interchangeably, but basically this is what happens when someone's arrested, they have a case referred to the office. Who's being referred to the office? We're going to talk about this on the difference based on race and to some extent where people live in Ingham County and how that might reflect their household income. Talk about what happens once warrant requests are referred, which ones get denied, which ones move forward. If a case is filed, we'll talk about what are the most serious charges associated with those cases, and in some cases, other charges. Basically talk about what does the actual caseload look like, what's being handled by the office. And of course, as I said, we're going to talk about some things specifically related to policy decisions, including probably most prominent in people's minds right now, or certainly was, as I understood in the local media, this felony firearm changes. couple things we're not going to talk about today that we might have in a future report or we might be able to do in future presentations, just stuff to keep in mind that it's out there. Some of that is estimated victim demographics, or really victim demographics at all. Why not emphasis on the word estimated? Basically, we don't have any information. And I don't think it's very good use of our time today to try to explain all the murkiness that would go behind the estimates that we have available. We'll continue to explore some other sources. We may have something we can release soon. I will give you as much information as I can, but I don't think it's a good use of our time today. Similarly, everything I just listed, right? We're not going to look at differences on the basis of gender today. I don't feel great about this decision, but it's kind of a time-based one right now. Again, happy to talk about it in the future, happy to release additional information as it's available. We'll certainly release something I hope eminently as well. Talk a little bit about household income, and I'll explain what I mean by that when we get there. And then for the same reasons as victim demographics, we're not going to talk about anything related to sentencing or criminal history today. I would say stay tuned for this is all I can say, because we're trying to find the data available to answer, at least in the ways that we look at things from this analysis perspective, and we just don't have it right now. All right, so before jumping into the actual data here, we'll just remind us 2 little housekeeping items here for how I like to do these presentations. As Mordecai ended at the top, please drop questions in the chat. I'd throw out one other thing. If you have a clarifying question and you're on the Zoom call, please feel free to just unmute and interrupt me and ask it. Unless everybody starts doing that, I think we should just start with that approach for now. Reason being, what do I mean by clarifying question? I mumble all the time. It's very hard to understand me. If you can't understand me, or I show a chart and it doesn't make any sense, I live in New York City. A siren's going to go by at some point and you won't be able to hear what I'm saying. Just stop me and ask me to repeat myself. This is going to be a colossal waste of all of our time if I talk for an hour and nobody understands what I'm saying. So we'll all benefit. If you can't understand me, I'll repeat myself. I'll try to explain further. On the flip side of that, try to keep more substantial questions. What I mean by that, things like, have you considered this hypothetical situation? What would things look like if you did X, Y, or Z, something like that. Try to drop those in the chat. We'll have a lot of times to break, or at least to reflect on questions in the chat. I'll prompt people for questions. Just try to hold it there. Reason being for that, sometimes I'll answer that question at a subsequent slide. Sometimes it's a really big question. We might not be able to get to it in the middle of the presentation. We might need to hold it for the end. And we'll just try to be discerning so we can get through everything we want to today. All right, and with that, we're gonna jump right into this here. So what are we looking at here on this first sort of odd shaped parallelogram looking thing here, right? This is the total number of all warrant requests submitted to Carol's office from 2015 to 2019. I want you to keep these numbers in mind because we're going to break these numbers down by a lot of different dimensions in the coming minutes here. But what are we looking at, right? Around 8,700 cases in 2015, around 8,000 cases in 2019. So a bit of a decrease, a lot of this likely stemming from the legalization of marijuana. If we break that down by the severity of the most severe charge that comes in with these warrant requests that are submitted, it looks like the most of this decrease is related to misdemeanors, again, following what we thought about this legalization of marijuana and misdemeanor drug possession. And you can see there, right, the decrease is almost 1,000 from 2015 to 2019. In contrast, for felony cases, decrease is pretty nominal. This decrease of 30 is hardly indicative of a trend, especially considering 2018, probably higher than 2015, where we were seeing about 2,265 cases. And you may have noticed right up at the top here, there's this great light gray area that's talking about missing charge data. This simply means usually these are cases which are submitted, but then are denied by the office, meaning they don't go forward. The warrant request is submitted, and then the office doesn't move forward with the case. We'll see when we get to that section, the number of cases where this occurred. This has increased over the years, but when that happens, there isn't necessarily charge data logged in the system that we have access to, so we don't really know anything about what the charges would have been had they gone forward. Something hopefully we can try to explore. Some future data sources may or may not get there. All right, zooming back out. Again, remember these numbers best you can. Total caseload here, around 8,700 cases in 2015, around 8,000 cases in 2019. If we break this down by the race and ethnicity of folks for whom these warrant requests are submitted against, you can see right there, very close to 50% of the caseload is submitted against Black folks. If you know anything about the demographics of Ingham County, you can probably tell from right here that this is pretty significant overrepresentation of Black folks relative to white folks. Blue line in the middle there represents the number of cases submitted against Latinx folks. This is almost certainly undercounted. Very happy to elaborate on that or share some additional resources for those who are interested as to why I'm so confident in that statement. But otherwise, rest assured that it's pretty well documented. Latinx people tend to be undercounted in criminal legal data sources. We'll talk about how much higher this would be if we got a different count in a moment. Something else I want to point out, because this is going to have a lot of relevance in terms of recommendations we want to make and everything else we talk about in this presentation, is that the overrepresentation of Black people is greater among felonies than it is among misdemeanors. So again, I'll give you the exact numbers in a second. Don't worry about trying to do too much comparison of these strange charts side by side, but I want to point out, first of all, the total number of felonies is quite a bit lower, of course, than the total number of misdemeanors. But you can tell if you just compare these different shaded areas of the charts, Black folks are close to 50% of felony cases, whereas white folks are closer to 30 or 40% of misdemeanor cases for Black folks. But as promised, let's give these in exact numbers. So lay this all out really clearly, right? So this is bar, it sums up to 100%. These are the demographics of Ingham County as of 2019, according to the US Census estimate. You can see 11% Black, 11% Latinx, 70% white. These are the demographics of the misdemeanor caseload, which is really the filed caseload by Carol's office on account of the fact that we don't have the information from cases submitted. You can see 37% misdemeanor cases were filed against Black people, 4% against Latinx people, 51% against white people. And then these are the demographics of the felony caseload 2019, in which 50% felony cases were filed against Black people, 4% against Latinx people, and 41% against white people. Very, very large overrepresentation relative to the demographics of the county overall. Now I've been talking a little bit about how I think these Latinx numbers are undercounted. I want to elaborate on this and kind of show this exact same information, but in a slightly different way, in part because it presents things in a way that we're going to use a lot in the coming minutes here. And so what this is showing is very similar information, but in the form of what we would call population rates, for those who might be familiar with that term. I know in this world of COVID news reporting, you come across the term rate an awful lot, unless you've somehow managed to miss all of the COVID news, in which case I would be frankly pretty impressed if you managed to do that. You might have heard things like infection rates, vaccination rates, etc. Essentially what this means is the number of times something occurs per the population. And so just to make sure we're all on the same page here, I'm going to walk through this one a little bit slowly, just to say in 2015, approximately 103.6 out of every Black people living in Ingham County had a case referred to the office. That's relative to 21.56 out of every 1,000 white people, give or take a small number of people who may have sent multiple cases in 1 year. For Latinx people below that, you can see the solid blue line reflects what's actually recorded in the data. The shaded area going up to the top represents how much higher that would be if we tried to use an algorithm to predict somebody's ethnicity on the basis of their name and where they live. I think it takes about 5 minutes to think about all the ways that might be problematic and wrong. I don't know that it's necessarily that much more accurate, but I do think it's probably better than what's currently in the data. So this maybe at least gives us an idea of how much larger the disparity between Latinx and white people might be, and which is nevertheless considerably lower the difference between Black and white people in Ingham County. If we look at the same information, but broken out by felony and misdemeanor cases submitted, so some of what we already looked at overall in terms of there being relatively larger overrepresentation among Black people in felony cases submitted. If we walk this out for say 2019, we see here 34.76 out of over 1,000 Black people living in Ingham County in 2019 had a felony case filed against them by the office, relative to 4.58 out of every 1,000 white people. If for some reason you were following along with a calculator, you wanted to compare the ratio of those two numbers, that would tell you essentially that Black people are about 7.6 times more likely than white people to have a felony case filed against them. And you can see the felony numbers are relatively flat. There's not a huge trend that seems to be going on there. As we looked at before, the misdemeanor cases have essentially declined for everybody. But I want to point out that these differences are not really proportional. So this decrease among Black people from 45.5 per 1,000 people down to 40.52. It's a decrease of close to 10%. Whereas this decrease for white people from 11.78 down to 8.75 is closer to 30%. Meaning that this change has had sort of an outsized benefit on white people relative to Black people who are involved in the criminal legal system. Now, I know that's a ton of content. I guess I want to pause here for just a second, see if there's any clarifying questions. We still have a little bit more on this in this overall section on cases received, but just before I get into that, I want to hold some space. I know that's a lot of stuff to cover.
There's a question in the comment section about the shaded area showing that Black folks are side over, I guess it's right, side over represented when compared to the algorithmic prediction. Can you look at that question? Or Zach, you can come off.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just looking at the shaded area for, well, I guess both white and black folks. It seems to indicate that like the algorithm predicted that there would be slightly fewer black folks than what was actually reported. Like, I wonder if that's just small enough to be noise based on the sample size, or if it's actually like something like, you know, the people filling out the reports are, you know, categorizing more people as white or more people as black. I guess that would assume that would actually track with the Latinx thing. I guess they would have to go into one of those two other categories.
Yeah, I think may have answered your own question, but let me try to say it back to you to make sure we're on the same page. Which is that if we were to use this algorithm to try to guess people's ethnicity, or mostly in particular to look for people who are Latinx who may have been miscoded, that shaded area under the red line indicating the number of cases submitted against black folks is how much lower that would be if we recoded some folks who were recorded as black, who may have had the chance to self-identify, for example, indicated they were Latinx. We can't really know, but that's what this algorithm might guess. There's a similar shaded area underneath the line for white people as well. But it's worth noting that doesn't have a very large change on the population rate for either black or white people, whereas that is a huge change for Latinx people, just because of the much larger number of people who are potentially miscoded there. Yeah, and I really don't want to put too many eggs at the name prediction basket. You know, I think it's a useful tool for reminding us how much like this blue line at the bottom is probably not representative of reality, but I don't think that we can really walk away and believe that the top of this shaded area is necessarily fact, right?
Andrew, there's another question about charge data. What's the disconnect? Why are there so many cases missing charge data?
Yeah, I don't want to seem too antagonistic to the office here. This is just merely like the way the data is recorded and the type of data that we have. So typically, if a case isn't filed, meaning that warrant request was submitted, but they don't move forward with filing charges, then there's no charge data entered into the database. And that makes a lot of sense from the perspective of using this database as a way to carry out the operations in a prosecutor's office. You know, it's obviously limited for what we'd like to do from a research perspective, and something that can hopefully change going forward without a whole lot of work. But, you know, in 2015, no one was necessarily thinking about using this data in that way. All right, I'm gonna move us forward a little bit because we still got a little bit more in this section. So I want to keep on going for a sec. So I set this up at the top, right? We were going to talk a little bit about household income, and that was going to be a little bit confusing. What I really mean by this is people who live in the lowest income areas, or really based on the income of where people live. And the reason for looking at this primarily is that's where we have data. So everybody see this map okay? Is that working out? All right, so this is a map of Ingham County by census tract. For those who don't know, census tract is sort of a roughly proportional unit of geography and population. You know, they're not perfect, but give or take, these enormous census tracts out here in the suburbs have populations which are pretty close to these much smaller census tracts within the Lansing area. In this particular map, census tracts are shaded by the median household income of that census tract. If you're curious why these values and why the median, you know, I'm happy to elaborate. It's one of my favorite, incredibly nerdy subjects. But otherwise, rest assured, it's just sort of an accurate way of breaking these things into 4 categories. The darker the red, the lower the median household income. Above that, these circle markers that I'm hovering over right now, these are cases submitted to the office based on the defendant's home address. This is where people live who are having warrant requests submitted against them. You can tell right from eyeballing this, right? The majority of cases come from Lansing, which is probably not a surprise. That's where the majority of people live. This is also where the majority of low-income areas are. But if we were to say zoom in on just Lansing here, we can tell, again, just really quickly, intuitively, there's a larger number of these clusters in the lowest income areas. The darker the red shading, typically the larger number of cases we're seeing, not all the time, but a lot of the time. We'll look at the precise numbers for this in a second, but it's just to say that people who live in the lowest income areas are much more likely to have a case submitted against them. And this has some pretty deep intersections with race and ethnicity in Lansing, as I suspect a lot of the folks on this call would know very well, but I think bears pointing out, right? We also look at the breakdown, race and ethnicity of these places. For example, we're looking at the same map here by census tracts, but the darker the green the shading, the greater the population share. In that census tract is Black. We can see a lot of the same low-income areas, a lot of the places with the most number of cases referred in the Lansing area are places that have the largest Black population. And sort of the flip side of that, if we look at areas that have the largest white populations, predominantly in the suburbs, the same areas that typically have higher incomes and have much fewer cases referred. You can see here with the darker the shading, the larger the proportion of the population is white. So to put these in really precise terms, right? Here is another chart essentially showing in very precise terms everything we just looked at on the map, which is what is the difference in having a case referred on the basis of the income of where people live. This top red line, these are the darkest red shaded areas. In that first map we looked at, people from the lowest income areas, much more likely to have a case referred than people in the, on that map were the lightest shaded areas, but here are the blue line at the bottom, the highest income areas. And if we go back to talking to how do we say, look at the differences in felony and misdemeanor cases, what I really want to point out here too, again, is the extent to which this decline in misdemeanor cases submitted has really not been proportional. It's where we look in 2015, about 19 out of every 1,000 people living in the lowest income areas of Ingham County had a misdemeanor case submitted against them. That's down to about 17 in 2019. Whereas for people from the highest income areas, it was around 12 in 2015 out of every 1,000 people living in the highest income areas, down to about 6.77 or so in 2019. Not at all proportional decreases, a decrease of more than 40% for people in the highest income areas, decrease of closer to 10% for people living in the lowest income areas. A few more things on location before we sort of wrap up on a lot of this data, summarizing cases that are coming into the office. And that's, we can look at the extent to which there are disparities in people who are homeless or houseless. I'd say actually pay really close attention to this axis right here, right? So this is going from 0 to 20 per 1,000 people. Now we're going to 0 to 400, which is to say that people who are homeless are a lot more likely to have a case referred against them than anybody else. It gets a little bit confusing here to use this per 1,000 metric. I like to say consistent with that because it allows us to say make comparisons to where people who are living in different parts of the area, different size populations, and so on. But if that's too confusing, let's just make it really clear, right? In 2015, 187 every 1,000 homeless people in Ingham County had a case referred to the prosecutor's office. That's a total of 74 cases because at least according to the data I have access to, there weren't 1,000 homeless people in Ingham County on any one given night. That's up to 113 cases in 2019. Suggests that there are many homeless people who are being caught up and having a case referred to the office, many more than any other group if we were to draw people into those particular boundaries. And just to kind of underscore the extent to which this intersects with demographics in Ingham County, zoom back out for a second here, right? So remember, this is our bar of all of Ingham County according to the US Census, 11% Black, 11% Latinx, 70% white. So the demographics of people with a case referred against them who live in the highest income areas of Ingham County, it's 14% Black, 74% white. Is the demographics of people with a case referred against them in 2019 from the lowest income areas in Ingham County, 53% Black, 37% white. And these are the demographics of people with a case referred against them who are homeless or houseless, and that's 66% Black, 32% white. So that was a lot. It's really heavy stuff, a lot of information to go through. I want to take a second, sort of pause, recoup here, see if there's any more questions in the chat, anything you want to go back and look at again. Just hold a couple seconds here.
Andrew, oh, sorry. Go ahead, Zach. I saw that you unmuted.
Oh, thanks. I was just curious how people were divided into the income quartiles, if that was based on like geographic area median income, or if it was actually based on like individual household income. And then if it was, were the quartiles like equal distributions of population, were the same number of people in each quartile?
Yes. Well, let me back up. So the first part, people were sorted into it on the basis of their home address, according to what was submitted to the prosecutor's office. Unless, of course, they were homeless or houseless, in which case they didn't have a home address, or their home address was a homeless shelter, meaning there isn't necessarily a good reason to put them in the census tract there. In terms of how the quartile ranges were selected, it's based off of the median household incomes per census tracts, weighted by the population of those census tracts. So it's roughly proportional. I don't think it's perfectly even, but it's probably as even as you could get, barring some fancier math tricks.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, no worries. No one ever asked me those questions, so it's exciting for me.
You're welcome. I was thinking like the top quartile, like, wealth distribution is just like so logarithmically effed. So I didn't know if like the top quartile was like 6 people or something. But it doesn't sound like it was.
No, it's a good question for that reason.
There's one comment in the chat, Andrew, about are the charges against unhoused people related to them specifically being unhoused, or are there specific crimes police are using to get them into the system?
I would say stay tuned for that, because we're about to look at cases submitted against houseless people. So we'll look at the top most serious charges that show up there. Though I'm sure to make a note to when we get there, maybe shout outs to Jack. I think, just because we'll see certain things that show up in the charges, those are not necessarily indicative of, are these the same things that we could file against people who aren't houseless? It's an open question that requires some interpretation, I think.
Yeah, I'd like to get some reflections from folks. I know we're always just trying to get interaction, but at this pause, what are you hearing? Like, what are you sensing? Put that in the comment section. How is this impacting you, right? When you sit there and look at it, because people always talk about, what does the data show? We need more data. We got to look at the numbers. And so here we're sitting here in this People's Assembly, and it's about the data. And so I'm interested to hear your thoughts, right? So please fill up the comment section. So now it's just us in the Zoom. We've gone off live, so we only do the first 30 minutes. So for those of you all that were concerned about going viral, you won't have to worry about going viral right now. So while people are putting their comments in, you all can, go to the next phase.
All right, I'll jump forward here. All right, so moving into cases charges, right? So everything we just looked at that's everything that comes in, for the most part anyway, everything that's coming into Carol's office before they've necessarily made any decisions. Now we're going to look at what are the cases that are moving forward. So what are we looking at here? This is the top 10 felony charges, which is the fastest and most accurate I've ever said that, which is to say it's summarizing the entire felony caseload by the most serious offense of those cases. I don't actually want to linger too much on these, because we're going to look at these summarized into categories in just a second. I think that sometimes it's easy to get a little bit lost in the nuance of the statutes, but just in the interest of being totally transparent here, especially because we're still working on some of the categories, I want to throw this out here. And we can see right up at the top, right? So there is, out of all the felony cases that are going forward, there's a pretty serious charge that's there. But there's also instances of carrying a concealed weapon. It's not a serious charge, but also remember, this is the most serious offense associated with these cases, which means I think pretty inarguably not necessarily a crime related to interpersonal violence occurring in these cases at all. And then we see different types of drug possession coming in below that. Absolutely felony cases that are moving forward, large portion of the caseload which are not necessarily related to violence. And we'll look at this summarized in just a second. In contrast to all of my anxiety about statutes not showing enough information, when we look at the misdemeanor caseload, it's a completely different story. There are 2 misdemeanor charges, which account for a huge portion, almost half of all misdemeanor cases which go forward. And that are charges related to misdemeanor domestic violence and operating without a license, or a license suspended, rather. And we'll see when we summarize these, it's an even greater share of the overall caseload. I want to point out something too with respect to domestic violence here. So this is suggesting it's 23% of the misdemeanor caseload. The actual, I would say, burden of domestic violence within the caseload overall is quite a bit larger. And we'll work on getting you some more precise numbers on this. I can certainly follow up with anyone's interested after today. But keep in mind, this is just based when this is the most serious charge, in this case being a code related to misdemeanor domestic violence. There are quite a few, say, felony assaultive type charges, where there's also a misdemeanor domestic violence charge filed in those cases. There are also situations of intimate partner violence in which there isn't necessarily this type of domestic violence charge filed at all. So we shouldn't walk away from this thinking that this is the full extent of how domestic violence adds to the caseload. Now, as I was just saying, we look at things summarized into categories. This is still just the felony caseload. These are different names for a bunch of different types of statutes that I'm happy to give examples of if anyone's curious. But this is attempting to summarize a lot more of the caseload in a way that I hope is a little bit clearer to understand. So in this case, we're looking at something almost the entire felony caseload summarized in this chart of 10 different categories here. We can see at the top all of our assaultive or assault and battery felonies for the title. That's a large portion of the caseload, but nearly a third of the entire caseload is accounted for felony drug possession, drug sales, and theft and forgery charges, right? So theft and stolen property charges, number 2, felony drug possessions, number 3, sort of drug sales related charges down there, forgery down there. If we look at the misdemeanor categories, probably unsurprisingly, way up at the top, almost a third of all misdemeanor cases are in this category retitled vehicular. You know, almost all of those are operating with suspended license charges that we saw before. Below that are the domestic violence charges and misdemeanors we were just talking about. And here, if we summarize all the different types of misdemeanor retail thefts and stolen property charges into one category, we see it's a pretty large burden on the overall misdemeanor caseload. And similarly so with DUIs. And from there, we've covered nearly all the misdemeanor cases that are filed, and the numbers start to get very, very low. So we're going to look at these differences in categories split up by a couple different groups on just the next couple of slides. But before we do that, any clarifying questions on these categories? I'm seeing the chat blow up there. I haven't looked at it. All right. I get to make one of my favorite comments here, which is that I'm very comfortable with silence. So I will sit here, as long and uncomfortable as that is. No.
Lauren did point out, like, when one of the slides had something about interfering with electronic devices, which it wasn't like a huge representation for, I think it was misdemeanors, maybe it was felonies. Like, what is that even? I think it was felony.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm hoping one of the lawyers answer this one. I think, all right, I'll try, and then Jack or Carol, maybe you can point out how wrong I am. I think a lot of this has to do with people either taking somebody's phone or like in some ways messing with someone's phone. This is a terrible explanation. I should not have even tried.
Yeah, I think that's the closest I can get, and it's a comparatively new charge, but it's one we use a lot, and it often does often involve domestic violence or other cases where someone takes someone's phone, or someone is using it to misrepresent who they are, things like that.
Thank you. The first thing that came to mind for me was like somebody like attacking a 5G tower or something, and I was like, so that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
Not yet, thankfully.
Okay, anything else on any of these categories? Yeah, thanks for that comment, Ash, on the extent to which we see resisting and obstructing police. I think this is a pretty, the way you describe it there, it's a pretty contentious charge. I think in other jurisdictions, I've certainly seen it's one of the most overcharged things, and it seems to be pretty subjective. I don't know, Jack, is there anything you wanted to elaborate on there? I feel like we've talked about this one before, but.
We have talked about it before. There is a whole host of conversations that are happening in the policy world around what to do about charges like that. Some places require, body cam footage to be viewed and reviewed, like Carol's office. They will review body cam footage before authorizing a charge like that. And Carol's office does have their own policy, if she wanted to talk about it, for how they evaluate those charges. But when it comes to coming into this with a national perspective, and also coming into this as when I was a former prosecutor, you're absolutely right. It has always been overly used for Black and brown folks. And it comes up in other charges as well. That's going to be highlighted a little in like a couple slides when thinking about how this applies to how issues of police violence, physical police violence manifest in criminal charges that are then put forward, because we know that historically police have used charges like resisting arrest as a way to justify their own violence that they instigate against Black and brown people. That's a thing that does still happen across the country. And when I was investigating police officers, that is a thing that still happens. So it would be unfair for me to even say like that's not a real issue. So different prosecutors' offices execute their discretion in different ways to try to cut down on that. And so you'll have some people who feel as though it should never be charged ever because it's impossible. Like, what do you want people to do when they're being arrested? Do you like literally want them to just like be on the ground and not move at all, even though everybody knows that an arrest in and of itself is a violent thing? Or do, like, how does that, on the spectrum of like, how exactly are people supposed to act, all the way to if a police officer is starting the confrontation, which I've seen plenty of body cam footage of them starting the confrontation and then wanting to charge resisting as a way to cover up the sort of injuries or anything that could have happened during that protest, during that arrest. So that is something, how people want to handle that can go everywhere from getting rid of that charge completely off the books, right? And passing laws that get rid of that charge completely so that it's not something that could be charged, all the way to, asking your prosecutor to evaluate cases a certain way and maybe learning more about what your prosecutor's policy around making those types of giving those types of charges to. And like I said, Carol's office has a heightened scrutiny sort of way of looking at these cases where they review every single piece of evidence that could be available as a way to really evaluate the officer's claims, because historically prosecutors just go by whatever the officers tell them. And now we have a lot more prosecutors who are willing to second guess that. So thank you so much for raising that.
I can add super quickly to that. So our policy in Ingham County came out in August of last year, but it actually, began working on it before George Floyd, but obviously that situation really accelerated our interest to do that. And it was a couple East Lansing cases that some of you are familiar with. One was a misdemeanor from the city attorney's office and one was our case. But that was what changed our policy, because the police report was very terse. And when we saw the body cam video, which was several months later, it was very clear we wouldn't have issued it had we known all the circumstances. Now, in those days, we weren't getting the body cam footage from East Lansing Police Department routinely. So we started a policy that said we will review it when it's available. And then we modified that policy early this year, because we said, no, basically we're going to review that footage because there were still situations where we weren't getting the footage in a timely fashion. It takes a long time to download it and transmit it. But we felt that there were circumstances that were ones we really wanted to fully consider. So I know, and I don't have the data right in front of me, but our number of RNOs dropped really quite dramatically. But it's also hard right now to make any predictions because of COVID and just everything that went on in the last year is what it means when caseloads went down during 2020-21.
Great, thank you for that, Carol. I saw there was another question in the chat. I don't know the answer to that. If anyone wants to take it or maybe just answer in the chat, I might, in the interest of time, keep us moving here for a second. That's all right. All right. So as I mentioned, we can also compare differences in what cases are being filed against people, say on the basis of race or where they live. And that is exactly what we're doing here. So this is showing the top 10 top felony categories filed against Black and white people, percent of all felony cases filed against Black people on the left, and felony cases filed against white people on the right. There are pretty big differences here. Now, from my mind, from where I've stayed, where our whole goal here is how we're going to come up with recommendations that reduce racial disparities. What I really want to drill down on here is we got to think about when we make recommendations, what's going to have an outsized benefit on white people and what could instead benefit Black people, or ultimately deal with the charges that are being filed against Black people in a way that can reduce racial disparities. Very big differences here, for example, in terms of felony drug possession. That's the #1 charge that's being filed against white people, about twice as likely compared to Black people. Smaller, but probably no less important differences in terms of assaultive charges against Black and white people, theft charges, weapons possession, other charges like that. So going down. Now, we can also look at these differences on the basis of the income of where people live. So if you sort of think back to those maps I was shown at the very top, on the left, we're looking at all felony charges filed against people who live in the lowest income areas. Those the dark red shaded areas in that map we looked at the very beginning. And on the right, people living in the highest income areas. That was the lightest shading on that map we were looking at the top. It's a little bit confusing because there's not all that many felonies filed against people from the top areas, but there's some very big differences here. All right, let's look at how much more big differences in assault, big difference in theft as well. From there, the numbers start to get pretty low. It starts to get kind of hard to make comparisons. Getting back to a question about charges filed against houseless or homeless people. If we look here against all felony charges which are filed against houseless or homeless people, first of all, there's not all that many felony charges filed against houseless or homeless people. They're much more likely to be charged with a misdemeanor. But when we do look at the felony charges that come in, we can see it at the very top is theft and stolen property related charges. I think probably very undeniably an economic crime in the case of people who are houseless and homeless, or most likely anybody. Below that is assaulting a police officer. And this is speculation, but I don't think it's controversial speculation to suggest that when you have houseless or homeless people charged with assaulting a police officer, this might very well be related to serious mental illness or a whole bunch of other factors that are not necessarily what might be included in just the charge. And we see drug possession charges from there, and then below there, the numbers start to get quite low. If we take a look at differences in misdemeanors, again, here looking at the basis of household income, we can see for whatever reason, traffic charges are a little bit more common against people who live in the top income areas. Perhaps, I don't know, if you live in the suburbs, you're more likely to drive places. I don't know. Below that, see DUIs also much more common. But importantly, these misdemeanor domestic violence charges, very big differences there as well. Pretty big differences in terms of theft. And then when we look at misdemeanor cases which are filed against homeless or houseless people, over half of them are related to theft and stolen property. This category down here related to poverty and trespassing, I mean, these are a lot of charges related to, camping in public, things like that. Pretty explicitly charges having to do with not having a house. So, questions on that last kind of half of the section there? Anything we want to go back and follow up on, get more information on? Anything unclear?
I just wanted to amplify and bring back the fact that, remember, Black folks are 50% of the felonies that are charged in the office. So let's think about, for me, as a prosecutor looking at this information, it's really helpful to keep the perspective of who, not only what people are getting caught up for, but the overlaps and the disproportionality when it comes to felonies, when it comes to misdemeanors, and how does that interact with different laws and different laws, different rules that kind of govern society, right? So when we think about collateral consequences, for folks that have felonies, it shows up in the data when we think about, yes, Black folks are 50% of the felony crimes that are charged, and that we want to look at what kind of felonies are they getting caught up for, and what are some of the overlaps around that. So something that I just think, you know, that first comes to mind that we're going to be, that I just kind of use as an ask a question, because this is something that just comes up in conversation as we've been working with One Love Global and some other conversations that we've had with folks in Lansing, is the overlap between gun enforcement laws, right? In a state where you technically have the right to bear arms, and all the ways in which then guns are also regulated within a jurisdiction where you have the right to bear arms. So, you know, if Black folks are 50% of the felonies, and we have to look at the felonies, we have to look at how that can impact a person's ability to have a legal gun. And then what does that mean when we also look at other, you know, as we move through some of this data. And I'm just saying this because it's conversations, like I said, that we've had and heard and learned about. I'm from New York City, so our state constitution, our like local laws are very, very different. So I'm just bringing this out as something that's come up in conversation with folks like Mordecai, where we've talked about gun violence, right? And what is gun violence? How is that defined? How do we understand that within the racial history and racialized system that we live in today? So when I've looked through the data multiple times, it always stands out to me, not only the disproportionality of the 11% to the 50%, but then also how that overlaps with gun enforcement laws. So I just wanted to share that in case it's something that folks do think about in their day-to-day.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. That's a really, really important context to remember, especially for this stage of where we're at in the presentation. Any reactions to what Jack just shared, or anything else we want to go back through in this section?
I just wanted to really quick point out on that last slide that I work in the area of sexual violence prevention and addressing that, and 3% of, I can't remember which, I don't think this was the slide. Can't remember which one it was. One of them said 3% of white people were charged with it, and 3% of Black people were charged with it, and 6% of white people were, which is like really surprising since it's so not charged in general. And like also it's like one of the only ones I can see that's like more, like, I guess maybe that's not accurate. I'm sorry. Yeah. I just wanted to point that out. I thought that was interesting.
I think Ash has highlighted a really important aspect, and that's the domestic violence. And we're not looking at the civil child protective proceedings, but those cases are also ones where people who are white are just as likely to commit, you know, those kinds of offenses. But there are many reasons why the case is presented to our office, and certainly some of them are the, you know, housing density. There are the options, as I think Ash alluded to in our chat. There are more resources available in whiter or more affluent communities. So what we have, we look at what we get, and there is a disproportionality there. And then that disproportionality, as Andrew is going to be talking about more, just keeps getting pulled through the system. And that's the place where we're going to be looking at, what do we do about that? You know, when we can't control necessarily what we get to a large extent, but we can control a little bit better what we do with it once we get it.
Yeah, thank you both for that. I think it's really clear, and maybe a good indication that, especially looking at these sexual assault crimes, something to dig deeper into, get some more specifics on what's going on there. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and move into the next section then, which is talking about warrants denied. So everything we just looked at, right? These are the warrant cases that were submitted, that were filed. Now we're going to look at what happens to the warrant requests that were submitted that did not go anywhere, that were denied. And remember, we don't necessarily have any data here for what the offenses, I guess is the technical term, what the charges would have been had they gone forward. So we're going to just look at things at a relatively high level here to do a whole lot of interpretation. So first of all, this is the proportion of all warrant requests submitted that were declined from 2015 to 2019. I guess just to be extremely explicit, this means that all charges submitted were denied. This doesn't count anybody. If 3 offenses were submitted against them and 1 of them went forward, that doesn't count. This means that everything had to be denied. And this doesn't include anybody who was diverted in any sort of pre-charge diversion as well. These are just sort of denied outright, as they say in other jurisdictions. So we can see a pretty big increase from 19% of all submitted to 26% in 2017. 7 percentage points might not sound like a huge amount, but try to remember what we're talking about here. We have almost 8,000 cases in 2019 at least, so 7% of 8,000. It's not an insignificant number of people, right? Hundreds of people who, at least from a progressive perspective, right, potentially big change to their life to not be involved in the criminal legal system. And this has remained fairly flat, 2017, 2019, at about 26%. If we look at how this has changed for Black and white people, it is very uneven. 2015, about 18% of all warrant requests submitted against Black people were denied, versus 19% of white people. It's up to 27% for white people, to 22% for Black people. It's a very large gap. Growth has not been even. Now, we can spend a lot of time trying to speculate on why this is, and I'm genuinely interested to hear people's feedback. Try to interpret this from your own perspective. I can only offer really what I've looked at in the data, which is everything that we've seen so far. Try to speculate to what extent this is a difference between what would be misdemeanor and felony cases. But there are many possible explanations for this. So very curious to hear thoughts on that, perhaps in a moment. But one other thing I want to show is if we compare this again on the basis of the income of where people live. So what are we looking at here? This is the difference between, on the blue line, these are the people who live in the highest income areas. 18% of warrant requests were denied in 2015. And the red line, people from the lowest income areas. Very large gap by 2019. Was that 8 percentage points? He said, hoping he could do math in his head correctly. And if we were to say, look at homeless or houseless people, then on top of that, it's a very difficult thing to measure. It's sort of a erratic line. Worth noting, though, that at least what we look at here at this level, almost people from the highest income areas almost twice as likely to have their warrant request denied as people who are houseless or homeless. Now, this is probably the briefest section that I have because we just don't have that much information that we can dive into here. But very curious to get reactions, anything that wasn't clear, anything you want to look back at more.
The only thing I'd want to add is the reasons why certain cases might be declined by the office. So some of this data is capturing not only, the prosecutor getting the warrant request from the police, looking at it and saying, no, this isn't right, and they can just not authorize that request. But this is also reflecting data of pre-charge diversion. So if there are certain cases that come to the office, Carol's office does have their own sort of diversion criteria where they'll refer people to another program or another. Oh, I'm sorry, Andrew, these aren't diverted, but it's in the declination statistics, is it not?
No, this is it was at one point, but in the intervening months of doing these presentations, we've pulled them apart now.
Oh, you pulled it. Okay, I'm so sorry. I don't
That's
want to
okay.
confuse people. So these then, to be clear, are the cases that the office looks at and says, okay, no, we don't want to go forward on this, just point blank, separate and apart from a consideration around the programming. Okay. I'm sorry to confuse folks. That is something that we've been having a lot of conversation about.
Thanks, Jack. I just want to note that there's a pattern here in this section. We saw that there's been an increase in the warrant requests that have been declined by the office. There's also been generally a decrease in the warrant requests referred by police. But just want to amplify that both of those changes, although they have resulted in less contact with the system, have disproportionately benefited white people or people from the higher income quartiles. I think that's part of why sort of like the Vera team and in our work with the office and with Carol, we really focus on explicitly following the leadership and the needs of directly impacted Black and Brown communities, because we've sort of seen through the data and waves of like general decarceration that they do not in and of themselves address racial disparities or the system's sort of like legacy of control. So just wanted to amplify those pieces. Turn back to you, Andrew.
Oh, great. I mean, thank you so much, both of you, for amplifying that. Don't want to lose sight of any of that in the process here. Let's see. Forgive me, I did not read all of your comments, Zach, but I'm going to go ahead and move on unless anybody else wants to shout out questions on that section. We'll talk about traffic and pedestrian stops, or specifically traffic and pedestrian stops by the Lansing Police Department from 2015 to 2020. So this is a chart, actually looks a lot like some of the ones we looked at the very top here. We're looking at the total of number of people who were stopped by police for a traffic stop, Black and white people between 2016 and 2020, out of every 1,000 people, which is to say approximately 47 out of every 1,000 people living in Lansing stopped or had a traffic stop by the Lansing PD 2016 relative to 70 out of every 1,000 Black people. This is the first time I've shown any data related to 2020. Mostly in this case, I just want to point out how much of an anomaly it is. A lot of our analysis has been focused on 2015, or in this case, 2016 to 2019. The goal being to try to look at trends of what we thought were more conventional practice by the office, right? 2020 is an anomaly for a lot of reasons. It's very hard to make comparisons, but you know, we're coming up on almost 2022 here now. So very likely something in the future, we're gonna have to dive a little bit more deeply into 2020 and 2021. But for now, just try to stay focused mostly on these areas. Now, once again, if you were to compare these differences in rates, it's very clear Black folks are a lot more likely than white folks to be stopped, but specifically this indicates in 2019, Black folks are about 1.7 times more likely to be stopped for a traffic stop than white people. Almost all of these are equipment violations, not all of them, but quite a few, and we can spell that out more specifically in the future. Question from there is what happens after folks are stopped by the police? In particular, we're interested in how much more likely are people to be searched, and what we can see here is that pretty much consistently across all years, don't really even need a calculator for this one, Black people are about 3 times more likely than white people to be searched once they get stopped by the police. Now there is a study, maybe some of you are familiar with it. It's called the Stanford Open Policing Project. It's worth a Google if you're not. What they did, they looked at, I think, hundreds, maybe thousands of different counties across the US and tried to answer very similar questions to what we're talking about here. They wanted to look at racial disparities, how much more likely are Black, and in that case, Latinx people than white people to be stopped by the police, and how much more likely are they to be searched after being stopped. And they asked these questions in the context of trying to answer a very controversial question, which is to say, they see disparities that look a lot like this almost everywhere in the US they look. Is there then a difference in contraband recovery? Meaning, if Black people are more likely than white people to be stopped and then searched, are they also more likely to have some sort of discovery of contraband upon being searched by the police, which is oftentimes what we might hear to arguments that try to justify these disparities. And by and large, what the Stanford Open Policing Project finds is no. That's not the case in almost every county they look at, and when they find situations in which police can't ascertain the race of a driver, disparities decrease, and there's really no change in contraband recovery. Now we can try to do a little bit of a miniature version of that in Lansing with the data that's available. And that is exactly what we're doing here, which is comparing how much more likely are Black or white people once they're searched to result in any contraband recovery. And that's, I should say, any contraband recovery, that's broadly speaking, anything that the police would consider to be illegal. So that's, you know, stolen property, but also drugs, weapons, anything we could think of. And what do we see here? Well, it varies from year over year, but in all years, it's very, very close with the exception of 2020, in which white people were actually a lot more likely to yield any contraband recovery than Black people. But recall, this is a very anomalous year. We should be real cautious about trying to make any inferences from this about what normally happens. What we're showing here, this being the first time I've ever shown you these error bars on either side, you know, without wading too much into the statistics, I would say this is the outcome of a pretty conventional statistical test. Generally, what we're trying to look at with this is when we see these trends that are varying every year, you know, how confident are we that we're really seeing a difference between these groups, and this isn't, say, the cause of some other unexplained factor, including, for example, how much we might trust the accuracy of the data, for example. And it kind of confirms what I think is pretty intuitive, which is that when we see rates that are almost identical in some years, and rates that are, you know, flip-flopping in directions between other years. Basically, there is no, here we would say, statistically significant difference indicated by these overlapping confidence intervals. Black and white people are no more likely to yield contraband recovery once they're searched, which would, I think, make it pretty hard to justify any kind of disparities in stops and searches, right? And more specifically, we can look also specifically what the difference is in weapons recovery. And so this is after somebody is searched, how likely were police to find a weapon on them specifically. And we can see, first of all, it's quite a bit lower relative to all contraband recovery. And second of all, you know, there's very, very little, no statistically significant differences in any years. And then 2020, you know, an exceptionally strange outlier in which white people were much, much more likely. Now, I guess there's an open question: to what extent does this result in cases that ultimately get forwarded to Carol's office, right? So what's the actual burden of these types of stops on disparities that show up in the caseload? Because recall, a lot of, you know, some cases originate that way, a lot originate from calls from service. They're certainly not everything. We don't have necessarily a very satisfying or great answer for this, but one thing that we've been trying to do is to assess to what extent weapons possession and drugs possession cases specifically potentially originated from a traffic or pedestrian stop. And we do this on the basis of saying if the crime location doesn't list a street address, it just lists a cross street or just lists the street. Maybe not the most accurate proxy in the world, but very likely the best one that we have. And when we do this and we compare outcomes for Black and white people, it looks like about 50% of all weapons possession cases filed against Black people and about 41% of all weapons possession cases filed against white people originated from a traffic or pedestrian stop. A very similar disparity exists for drug possession as well. So certainly indicates that some of these disparities in certain searches, right, are resulting in differences in cases that are ultimately making their way to the office. Not a very comprehensive answer, but yeah, some information in that direction. At any rate, questions on this section? Anything that's unclear? Anything you want to go back at and look at more?
Andrew, can you talk about that a little more? Because that actually is really helpful for me, because I've been trying to figure out how do I evaluate whether weapons or drugs come from a traffic stop or not, because the police, we'd have to look at each police report as opposed to having, we don't have a way to quantify that. So you use a proxy if the location is a street, is not a home address, but rather a street location?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, that's
And
cool.
yeah, you know, that it probably doesn't work in a lot of situations where realistically something could happen on the street. But in the case of where the only charge is related to weapons or drug possession, you know, it's an assumption, but it feels like a pretty defensible one. I don't know how else you would necessarily know what someone possesses unless you search them, right? So I'm certainly open to feedback on that too. If anybody has other suggestions. Any other just sort of general reactions to this stuff?
We're just processing.
Yeah, that's fair. It's a ton of stuff. All right. We got about 2 more shorter sections, both related to policy to cover, and then we're gonna, I think, open this up for maybe a longer debrief. Maybe we'll take it from there with how we want to go forward with that. But I'm going to move on then and cover some of this information before maybe we take a longer time to process more. So we're going to talk about habitual enhancements. Those who don't know, the best way this has been explained to me is this sort of, in some ways, Michigan's answer to California's 3 strikes law. Probably not the most direct metaphor, but either way, the point is this: if somebody is repeatedly charged with felony offense, this is a way of adding a mandatory minimum amount of time that they have to serve in prison on top of that. What we are looking at here from 2015 on the bottom up to 2020 on the top in the gray is the total number of cases where habitual offender enhancement charge was applied at all. And then on red indicates that that offender enhancement was ultimately disposed as guilty, meaning it was filed and not dismissed at any point in the case. And again, here we're going all the way up to 2020 because we're trying to look at the differences in office policy. We can see in 2015, there was a lot more of these cases filed, right? They drop off pretty precipitously in 2019 and 2020. And very, very few of them by the time we get to 2020 are actually making it all the way to disposition. meaning that the penalty for them is actually being applied still. Now, so it's sort of an open question how there's so many that still get filed in 2019 and 2020, I think. Potentially even data related, but also potentially a question of what goes on with practice still. But nevertheless, big decrease and a lot less people serving more prison time as a result of it.
Andrew, when you say cases actually issued or disposed of, that means convicted or pled guilty or sentenced. So my policy I put into effect in late 2017 in my first year of office, but some of the cases that were still pending may not have been disposed of until later. Is that fair or not? I mean, in other words, we're talking about when they actually pled, were sentenced, or things of that nature.
I believe that's correct. Let me make sure I can double check this for you so I don't accidentally misstate it. But I believe that this is organized by like the last disposition date of the case.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I also want to amplify a good question from Zach in the chat about whether there was a specific policy change in the office around charging these enhancements. So I'm just gonna let Carol kind of talk about that because it's my understanding that there was.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I just referred to. In 2017, I'd been in office 6 or 7 months. I can't recall exactly when it happened, but that's when I put my habitual offender policy into effect and basically said, instead of just automatically doing it, which was the policy and practice, that we would look at factors like, is this person someone who maybe has avoided criminal responsibility disproportionately in the past because of witness intimidation or, causing a domestic violence victim to drop charges or things like that. And so to get a full, to give them full exposure, habitualization might make sense. Or are there other reasons, hate crimes where the crime that they might be charged with in and of itself wouldn't adequately reflect what they're really doing, but that otherwise we should assume that we should not habitualize, which is a dramatic culture shift for the office.
Yeah, thank you both for that. I'm sorry I should have taken for granted that was laid out there. So I really appreciate the extra information, and we can certainly see effects of that, I think, going into 2019, right? Something else that's changed as a result of, we say, compare 2015 to 2020 or 2019, which is that the types of cases or the most serious offense associated with these cases where the enhancement is applied has changed, and in a way where it's not necessarily applied to as many cases that aren't related to interpersonal violence. So to try to make that clear, in 2015, which is what we're looking at on the left side here, right? These are all of the cases where habitual offender enhancement were applied, organized by the most serious category associated with that case. And we can see at the top there's quite a few felonies, theft and stolen property cases that are having these habitual offenders enhancement applied, quite a few drug sales charges, also assaults and sexual assault crimes, drug possession cases. Continuing. If we compare this to 2020, we do see a bit of a drop off in terms of the crimes that aren't necessarily related to interpersonal violence, right? The number of theft and stolen property cases where this is being applied is quite a bit lower. Drug sales is lower, but still exists. Drug possession similarly so, low, but still up there. Assault and battery, though, becoming the number one. If we were to look at the differences in race for who's having these habitual offender enhancement charges filed against them, there are very significant disparities. So if we see, for example, in 2015, over the half of the cases where this offender enhancement was applied are cases that were filed against Black people. That's up to 61% in 2020, but relatively small numbers. The percentage could be a little bit misleading here. But remember, 50% of the total caseload was Black, 11% of Ingham County, or 50% of the felony caseload rather is Black, 11% of Ingham County is Black, 61% of these cases where these enhancements are applied filed against Black people. Certainly some compounding disparity in terms of who's being affected by these longer sentences. Questions on that section?
I just want to give space. I see Mordecai shaking his head. I myself am feeling overwhelmed seeing this, especially the compounding. So I'm inviting people to kind of breathe right now as we go into the next section, which is also might also be, I mean, all of this is heavy, but it might also be particularly heavy for folks.
Yeah,
I'm-
thank you for that. Go ahead.
I'm sitting here weighing the data against the narratives in the community, right? As to why we need more police, right? Why we need this, why we need this, or I feel unsafe. And I'm looking at the data and it's telling me a whole nother, it's telling a whole nother story. And so that's kind of where my mind is, right? And so, you know, oftentimes the loudest person in the room, people get tired of that person talking and everybody just kind of gives in. But there are other narratives here that, you know, we need to lift up the voices of the most vulnerable and not move that lens away from the most vulnerable, you know, that are they're just constantly centered in and through every single slide. And there's prior damage. There's damage that has been done that there's never any, you know, harm reduction or reparations, right? We're like, oh, we screwed up, you know, in the last 5-6 years, so we're gonna do something different. And then it takes 2 years, it morphs into something else. So that's kind of where my mind is right now, is the amount of education that has to happen on the community side, you know, in our community about how we interact with these systems. It just continues to be a tremendous task, so to speak. You know, you get a teenager who gets arrested on, you know, stealing a jacket out of Kohl's or something, and you get a call to go to the court. And just being there is just, it's a whole nother world, right? And no one's prepared. And there's no relationship. Like everybody's got something else going on, like, you know, their focus. And you know, we've had single moms that say, hey, can we get someone from the church or someone from the community to be at the court with my son, not knowing you're gonna be there all day long. You know what I mean? So you need somebody who doesn't have a job or has to report. Like, it's just so many little nuances that on the backside that feed into why things happen and why things don't happen. And so that's kind of where my mind is right now.
Thank you so much for sharing. I mean, that fills in a lot more for me too. And I hope in a way that this can be connected to everything you're thinking about there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, like I told a story, the cop stopped me and asked me at 8 o'clock in the morning, and did I have any weapons in the car? It was his first thing out of his mouth. And I was like, it's 8 o'clock in the morning. Like literally, like, are you kidding me? It's 8 a.m. in the morning. Like, you know, I just dropped my kids off to school, and, you know, it's 8 o'clock. That was my response to the officer. Officer, it's 8 a.m. in the morning. And as he had his hand on his gun, and I could see him through my side mirror, and I was just like, this is insane, right? And when I asked him why he stopped me, he said that I picked up speed as I passed by him. I said, but did I break the speed limit? And he said, you picked up speed. And so, you know, luckily I had insurance, you know, luckily I wasn't riding dirty. You know what I'm saying? Like all those little things, right? And so as I'm just looking at your slides here, I'm thinking about how our community gets caught up and we end up, you know, being one of these data points. And so I don't want to belabor the hour here, but I do want to just continue to make sure that, you know, the lens is on, you know, where it needs to be focused on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I thank you again for sharing. There's nothing I can show that can tell a story like that, right? And that's what's behind every single thing we're talking about here. So I think it's really easy to lose sight of that gravity. Yeah, Dan, thanks. I saw Angela's comment in the chat too. It's huge. All right, well, I don't have a good transition here, but we got one more section to cover. Feeling ready to do it. Otherwise, anyone else have any reflections or anything else they want to offer up?
Thank you for filling up the comment section.
Yeah.
I think we're ready, Andrew.
All right. Let's do the last section. Talk about felony firearms. So these are another enhancement charge that's specifically issued. Somebody is charged with a felony and they have a firearm possession. If they're possessing a firearm while they do it. There we go. It's an additional 2 years to be served consecutively in prison, in addition to whatever else the charges are. I think important to state too, there's intended to be a carve out for this if it's a charge related to possessing a firearm. We can talk about that if it comes up. But first, this is from 2015 to 2019, total number of cases or warrant requests submitted or filed rather, I guess, cases filed. They contain this specific enhancement. That's the statute number for it up there. Kind of an erratic trend, relatively flat down in 2019 from 2015, though if we were to look at 2020 here, I'd see the numbers up above 2015. Something we'll be able to look at in future presentations, perhaps. Very large racial disparities here. Specifically 2015, 65% of all the cases filed with this enhancement charge filed against Black people, up to 71% in 2019. Kind of hard to know what to make with the percents, specifically year over year, because the numbers change a lot, but the point is they're very large. In fact, I want to spell out something, a little bit extra detail here. There was a report that came out in 2018 or came out recently about 2018 prison data by an organization called Safe and Just Michigan. I'm happy to provide a link to this if anyone who's interested. And what they did specifically was look at all the people who were in prison in Michigan in 2018 and why they were there. And among that, how many people were in prison and from what counties, specifically due to this enhancement charge. So that's both people who are in prison who have this enhancement charge filed and people who the only reason that they're in prison is because they had this enhancement filed against them, meaning they'd served all their other time for whatever else it was that this was filed against. And what they found was that for our people who were in prison in 2018 from Ingham County, 80% of people who were in prison with this habitual offender enhancement filed against them from Ingham County were Black, and 91% of people who were in prison, which the only reason they were in prison was due to this enhancement charge, were Black. And we compare that then to 2019, where we see 71% of all these cases where this enhancement charge was filed against Black people. And then ultimately recall right where we started here, 50% of total felony caseload is Black. 30 relative to 37% of the misdemeanor caseload, and ultimately 11% of the population of Ingham County. Very, very large disparities in terms of who's being affected by these enhancements. One more piece of information on this. In 2019, we can also look at the types of cases that are moving forward, the types of felony charges where this enhancement was being filed. It is a bit of an open question here, because you can see the very first top one here are charges related to weapons possession, which I believe is not meant to happen statutorily. So there could be something going on here with the data that we're trying to understand. Other possible explanations as well. But below that, you can see some of these are, interpersonal violence related charges. In some cases, they're not. Just related to drug use.
So Andrew,
Yes, go ahead.
Monica Janer's on this call, might be able to weigh in because she works with people re-entering after prison, and she's very aware of some of these discrepancies. So while carrying a concealed weapon is a carve out, in other words, if you have a carrying a concealed weapon, you can't tack on felony firearm to that charge. That's under the statute. But if you have felon in possession, which Monica's cases typically would, that's a 4-year felony. You can also have felony firearm, and pretty much any reckless discharge or other kinds of offenses. But probably the ones that Monica would find that greatest impact her clientele are the felon in possession. So that's why, of course, we put the policy into effect that's been so graciously received a couple weeks ago.
And we know we appreciate that so much.
I was being sarcastic, but maybe I don't know if we have time, but maybe you could give just a real quick and overview of how you see it, because you really do work with a population and clientele that's very impacted by the felony firearm charge.
In what content, Carol? What?
You were saying about people who then get stopped and are subsequently charged, like
right. Like the things that you've been talking about, like having something dangling or not having the car register because you can't get to the Secretary of State. I can't tell you how many times when I do intakes and I say, so what did you do? Driving while black, and that's exactly, that's how they define what is going on in their community with this relationship. And they have a registered gun. And that, they find some way to find a technicality that it's concealed, and then they make it a felony in possession. So yeah, it works, to their disadvantage all day long. And now we're seeing, of course, the feds coming in and getting these clients with the felony in possession. It's getting extremely sad.
So I'm just going to uplift that that is a tactic of calling in the feds when you have prosecutors who are utilizing their discretion in the way that the Supreme Court has already said that they can, which is to do justice, and it's not necessarily about getting convictions. Then we find across the country that if you have a prosecutor like that, now you have the state AG's office, you have the police department trying to go to other sources to then enforce that law or to go after the prosecutor. So that is very common. I think that that's something that, is something that the community it's important for people to know that there's always going to be some sort of adjustment to any sort of change that even your local prosecutor may want to take. I also just want to respond to what you had mentioned, Monica. Oh, Carol, I saw that you unmuted.
I can wait, but I was responding to what Zach said to me. So it's not our attorney general doing it, but we have two federal attorneys, the Western District, where we are in the Western District, and the Eastern District, which is Detroit and Ann Arbor and other places. There are numerous partnerships that I do support the idea of there being federal state partnerships, because there's times when the federal investigation may be cross jurisdictional, or we don't have a statute in our state, but it's also being used as a tactic. I haven't seen the specific data to say that's happening here, but as Jack has alluded to, it is. I mean, because that is what happens. As soon as a prosecutor says we're going to pull back, then it happened in Philadelphia when the prosecutor there said he was not going to pursue certain kinds of charges. Then the feds came in and started doing it. And I'm not disparaging them, but it is a serious concern because it's designed to subvert the kinds of things we're trying to do to be a more fair and just system.
I'm just gonna re-up. Thank you so much for that, Carol. I'm just gonna also, in response to what you had mentioned, Monica, I shared a book in the chat about written by a Black woman historian who goes into the history of the Second Amendment. and the ways in which basically, her theory is that the right to bear arms has only ever been for white folks and not for Black folks.
I
And
just wrote about that. I'm sorry, I thought you were done. Yeah, I've been doing a lot on that recently.
yeah, I bet you have. And so have we. So we're happy to, I think this is something that Mordecai and I have talked about multiple times, and really engaging in some education and conversation, even within Carol's office, around how the history of gun laws themselves are drawn out of, a history of slavery and the fear and white fear of Black retribution as a way to put it bluntly. But I love the work that you're doing, Monica. Happy to have more conversations with you.
Well, and it's interesting, and I say this all the time, and I know people think that, I'm crazy. But when I was on the governor's task force, one of the things I wanted to tackle was the gun laws, because I thought, they historically they're definitely racially, a difference in the conversation. Black people have a constitutional right to carry that gun just like anybody else, and so I've been working with a legislator to see if we could get legislation, and then COVID hit, and now we're back to that, and we got to reach back out. But you have a constitutional right to carry a gun to protect yourself, but yet if you get some type of technicality carrying that gun, whether it's felon in possession or having the registered gun and not having the CPL, you're going to get a felony. But yet you can drive a car, cars kill more people. Somebody that doesn't go take their test at the Secretary of State and get their license doesn't get a felony charge, and they get to have their license back right away. Where's the common sense in that conversation?
There is no common sense in that conversation. You have people like, in our community, we make decisions like, I own a firearm, I'm licensed, I got every kind of paperwork you can imagine, but I have to make a decision as to how I'm going to keep myself safe riding to an event and then coming back from an event, and the potentiality of me getting stopped from an event that I feel like I need to carry. But the risk is greater, the harm is greater of me getting stopped after an event on the side of the road trying to explain to an officer once he asks me, do you have a firearm? That's a whole nother situation. So 9 times out of 10, I've made the personal decision to not carry, because I can't control I can't control what happens on the side of the road. It can go left quick, or it can go left really quick. And so, that's a lot of mental stress to try to process that. But again, we don't have
one of the things. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I just say that's just definitely one of the things I see in my clients every day, because we have that conversation. What is it we can do to make it better in the situation so that, we don't keep having this conversation. Let's get some, like you said, there is no common sense. Well, we need the common sense, and I talk to my guys all the time about this. Well, I'm not giving them my ID because I don't have to. I get it. Just like you said, when you get pulled over, you got to start thinking in your head, well, how am I going to, and your mind doesn't always act to the right concert, right situation.
And sometimes the police act ignorant. Like they'll sit there and,
let's not just say sometimes, but
I mean, like beyond ignorant. Like they'll ask you like this dumb rhetorical question, and there's just no right answer. And they'll use the way you respond to ask you to step out of the car. Can I search the car? So it's just weird how it all goes down, right? Depending upon the situation. So this is a real issue for even those of us who are legal. We still don't feel we have the right to carry.
Yeah, that's huge. I mean,
So
thank you.
yeah, go ahead, Andrew. I know we're running.
No, that's okay. We're actually I mean, this is as good a time to officially do it. I feel like we're having a good conversation here, and maybe this is just the time to transition out, because that does it for everything that I prepared to share today. So I can give it back to you, Mordecai. We can just keep picking up on the rest of this thread here. Whatever works best, but that'll do it in terms of data we have for today.
Hey, well, I'd like for everyone to just, you know, give a shout out to Andrew and Jack and the whole team at Vera for putting all of this together. And Sarah, I mean, I definitely wouldn't forget you, Sarah. And so, like, the whole team, like, we've got some work to do, and we have another session, part 4, that we're going to be announcing, right? That's coming up soon. And what I'm going to ask personally, again, is if we could continue to have these conversations in our community and with the right narrative. We need to push this out and push this out and push this out, because we're losing the battle here. And so anyone have any, you know, closing comments? I do have a couple of announcements that I'd like to make really quick before we hand it over. Angela or Sarah, anyone have any closing comments?
Mordecai, thank you. Normally I just try to get in and get out without saying too much, but this chat has just been so lively today. And I see us thinking in the questions that we're raising. And early on, Christine, I really appreciate you asking the question about, you know, what cases are handled in which jurisdictions, because that's really an important issue. So if we have a prosecutor who's willing and has already begun to look at this data and make policy changes in their office, hearing about how federal agencies can step in, how city agencies can step in. We've seen how state agencies step in. So as we talk about what transformation really looks like, hopefully people get a better sense of why there is a global call to defund the police, because it's not as simple as just making policy changes, because it is a much bigger system. And it's not about individuals within who making decisions solely within the system, because the people can change, but the system finds a way to maintain and reinforce itself. So I'm really grateful to Vera for, you know, even getting the context of what is being done across the country and in other places. And Carol, you've certainly shared information that your colleagues, about the work that your colleagues are doing in other cities. So I'm just, I'm grateful to you all for taking a Saturday afternoon in these final days of summer to continue this conversation and know that this is an ongoing process that we're in. You know, we're a year into envisioning what a Lansing Breathe Act looks like. And there is, so for those of you who've been really involved in helping to develop the Breathe Act and our priorities, remember that section on prosecutor transformation. And so the question for us is, we're moving through this data, as we're moving through the policy changes, is what does that transformative policy look like? Are we getting closer to what a system that heals and repairs harm looks like? So thank you all for bringing this data, for bringing the context, and for the courage to do this work and to have these conversations.
Absolutely. As you can see, thank you, Angela. Anyone else have any closing comments, reflections?
I had something I wanted to not add, but recall actually that Angela said earlier in the chat, because like I said in the chat, and everyone could probably tell I'm a huge data nerd, so I can look at those charts and like charts can be emotional to me. I'm sure Andrew feels that with me. And like, but I recognized a lot that like that isn't the case for a lot of people. And I've been trying to focus on just in the stuff that I've been doing, like where do we take these data points and then where do we find the stories to tell that actually are behind that. And something I always really appreciate about these and the couple weeks ago, like hanging out after when we were actually at Well Enough Global and like talking to Mordecai, you always do an amazing job of like, you're so courageous in sharing your own stories behind all of these experiences that are being represented in the data. And even being like a numbers nerd, you know, that is always so much more impactful for me. And so Angela mentioned the importance of focusing on the stories behind it. And that's, you know, if we're talking about actually doing hearts and minds work and trying to build empathy across, you know, political divides and stuff like that, I think that's really where the focus has to be on, is how do you lift up the stories that are the people that are actually affected by these policy changes, or this, you know, like we're seeing compounded on compounded on compounded disparities. And what is it like to actually live on the other side of that? Because it's not, you don't get it unless, you know, I'm never going to get it, but you can get at least a slice of it if you can actually watch somebody tell, you know, that story of they were out of milk and then 6 months later they were in prison because, you know, whatever, they had their CPL and they went out and their taillight was burnt out and blah, 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 blah. And now they've got a, you know, 4-year sentence with an enhancement for felony firearms and whatever. Like, so that was all.
No, Zach, we appreciate that. Like literally, I mean, this is why we gather, and we listen. We listen to the stories, the narratives. I mean, these are real life experiences. You know, in schools, they call students data points. They don't refer to them as humans. They're data points. They're data points. Some schools, some educators. And so they're trying to make a shift in how you're like, do you really see me? How does the system view me? And oftentimes when you're standing there, you know you're not seen. You got to find a way to be human. Like, I need you to see me. And one of the questions that we'll break out later is, you know, the relationship between the prosecutor and the judge. Once you've made your recommendations, it's not over, right? And so that's another question that we can pick up later, is just that whole dynamic between prosecution and the judge and just the whole experience. So anyone else? Gray, I see Peggy. I see Chris. I hate calling names, you know what I mean? But you all are sitting in front of me. Oh my goodness.
I guess I can, yeah, I mean, what always goes through my mind when I'm, you know, in these conversations or listening to these conversations is that the entire US justice system is built on a core assumption that the police are honest. That trickles through from the police, the prosecutors, to the judges and courts and the laws themselves. And a large portion of the population has always known that's not true. And hopefully a lot more people these days know, yeah, that's just not true. And so getting data like this and other data we get access to that can show these problems, but then the huge resistance there is to changing these things, because the very foundations of the system have that built in. And when we talk about things like body cams and all, body cams are a tack on that we're putting onto this thing to try to bring accountability, when there's still a presumption that if a police officer is testifying in court that they're being honest. So if they lose their body cam, oh, well, we're assuming they're honest, or, you know, so many things like that. And so how we can change these things is such a big question, but there needs to be big changes to core assumptions to undo these things. And having prosecutors involved in this is a key part of that, because the assumption from prosecutors in general that police are being honest and bringing those charges because police said it, it's still built in what we're dealing with. But the more we have prosecutors in different parts of the system involved, the better we can do, because just trying to attack it from the side of changing laws doesn't actually change how it's enforced, doesn't change how judges, when testimony in court, how judges weigh certain testimony. Doesn't matter if you change the laws if that's still the assumption being made. So I'm very happy that Carol is involved in this and is making some of these changes. And it's this real key importance of getting different parts of the system on board, because we can't change it just from one part of the system.
Absolutely. Great, I appreciate that. The other issue that I like to, we like to address, I know we're running out of time here, is this domestic violence that's in our city. Like, I really want to dig and peel back the layers on, I mean, like, wow, I mean, and Andrew, that domestic violence piece is huge, right? And I want to know from a victim standpoint, like, how bad does it have to be for you to call the police? And like, it's got to be super bad for you to call the police in a domestic violence situation, because you know what you're going to get when they show up. And so I have a lot of questions about that portion, and we can, talk about some of that offline, but it's 3:58, folks. We're 2 minutes out from our stop, and, continue to put your reflections in the comment section. We have our virtual screening, save the date, on September the 8th. As you can see, at 7 p.m., racially charged America's misdemeanor problem. And so please mark your calendars for that. And then we have our part 4, and we're going to be announcing the date for that. And again, just ask you, each one bring one, right? Each one bring one. Find somebody that is a part of your organization, in your community circle, right? And bring them to these sessions. That's all I have. It's a beautiful Saturday. And again, we want to thank the folks from Vera and Carol. Good to see you again. And we will see you all on part 4. Have a great evening.
Everybody.